The story of Alexander Hamilton begins not in the halls of power or on the battlefields of revolution, but in the unstable world of the 18th century Caribbean. Born sometime between 1755 and 1757, Hamilton entered life under circumstances marked by uncertainty and social vulnerability. Even the exact year of his birth remains debated, a reflection of the fragile records and marginal position that defined his early existence. This ambiguity would later allow Hamilton himself to shape his narrative, but it also points to the precarious foundations from which one of America's most influential figures emerged. Hamilton was born on the small British island of Nevis, a society structured around sugar plantations, slavery, and rigid class divisions. His parents' relationship placed him outside the bounds of social legitimacy. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was trapped in an unhappy marriage she could not legally escape, and her union with James Hamilton was never formally recognized. As a result, Alexander was legally illegitimate, a status that carried lasting stigma in colonial society. From the very beginning, he occupied a position on the margins, excluded from inherited privilege and formal protection. Economic instability further shaped Hamilton's early life. His father, struggling with debt and poor prospects, eventually abandoned the family, leaving Rachel to support her children through a small trading business. This brief period of relative independence ended abruptly with her death from illness, an event that thrust the young Hamilton into poverty and isolation. Orphaned at a young age, he experienced firsthand the fragility of life in the colonial world, where illness, debt, and social exclusion could swiftly destroy a family. Forced to survive, Hamilton entered the commercial world at an unusually early age. Living on St. Croix, he worked as a clerk for a trading firm, managing accounts, correspondence, and shipments that connected the Caribbean to Europe and North America. This experience exposed him to the mechanics of global commerce, credit, and imperial power. Long before he encountered political theory, Hamilton learned how money moved, how trade sustained empires, and how instability could ripple across oceans. These lessons would later echo in his economic vision for the United States. Despite hardship, Hamilton's intelligence and ambition quickly set him apart. He educated himself through reading and writing, developing a command of language that astonished those around him. His talent became undeniable after he wrote a vivid account of a devastating hurricane, a piece so powerful that local leaders circulated it publicly. The essay revealed not only literary skill, but also emotional depth and analytical clarity, convincing benefactors that Hamilton's abilities should not be confined to the Caribbean. Funds were raised to send him to North America for formal education, an extraordinary opportunity for a boy of his background. This moment marked a decisive turning point. The Caribbean years had forged Hamilton's character through instability, exclusion, and responsibility far beyond his age. His uncertain origins did not weaken him. They sharpened his drive. Having seen how fragile life and status could be, Hamilton carried with him an unrelenting determination to rise, to impose order on chaos, and to secure through intellect and effort what birth had denied him. The Caribbean did not merely produce Alexander Hamilton, it shaped the urgency, resilience, and ambition that would define his entire life. The childhood of Alexander Hamilton was defined by loss, instability, and responsibility far beyond his years. After a brief period of fragile security, his world collapsed when his father abandoned the family, leaving Hamilton and his brother dependent entirely on their mother. In the rigid social hierarchy of the Caribbean, this abandonment carried not only emotional consequences, but also severe economic and social vulnerability. Without a legitimate family structure or reliable income, Hamilton's early life became a constant struggle against forces he could neither control nor escape. That struggle deepened with the sudden death of his mother, Rachel, from illness. Her passing left Hamilton effectively orphaned while still a child, severing the last source of protection and affection in his life. With no inheritance and no legal standing, he was thrust into a precarious existence shaped by the goodwill or indifference of others. In a society governed by class, legitimacy, and property, orphanhood meant invisibility. For Hamilton, it also meant learning early that survival depended on discipline, intelligence, and relentless effort. The years that followed exposed him to a cycle of displacement and uncertainty. Briefly taken in by relatives and acquaintances, Hamilton never experienced a stable household. Each move reinforced the temporary nature of his place in the world. These experiences fostered a deep awareness of insecurity and a lasting fear of dependence. Unlike children shielded by wealth or status, Hamilton confronted the reality that life could unravel at any moment, and that preparation was the only defense against chaos. Economic necessity forced Hamilton into work at an age when most children were still sheltered from adult concerns. Employed as a clerk in a trading house, he managed accounts, correspondence, and inventory for a firm deeply enmeshed in Atlantic commerce. The responsibility was enormous, yet he performed it with precision and maturity. Through this labor, Hamilton gained first-hand exposure to credit, debt, trade networks, and the brutal efficiency of colonial economies. Hardship became his education, teaching lessons no classroom could offer. Amid these pressures, Hamilton turned to reading and writing as tools of survival and self-definition. With limited formal schooling, he educated himself through books and careful observation. Writing became both an outlet and a weapon, a means to impose order on experience and to make himself visible in a world that overlooked him. His words revealed not only intelligence, but urgency, shaped by a life lived without safety nets. Expression for Hamilton was inseparable from ambition. These early hardships left permanent marks on his character. Orphanhood instilled resilience, but also an intense drive for stability, structure, and control. The fear of disorder that haunted his youth later translated into a lifelong belief in strong institutions and disciplined governance. Hamilton's childhood was not merely a prelude to greatness, it was the forge in which his outlook was shaped. From loss and insecurity emerged a determination to master systems of power, finance, and law, so that neither he nor the nation he would help build would ever be as vulnerable as the child he once was. The decision to send Alexander Hamilton to North America marked a decisive turning point in his life, transforming hardship into possibility. In the Caribbean, Hamilton's talents had become impossible to ignore. His intelligence, discipline, and powerful writing drew the attention of local patrons who recognized that his abilities far exceeded the limits of his environment. For a boy shaped by instability and loss, the opportunity for formal education offered not only learning, but escape. An exit from a world where birth-defined destiny and ambition had little room to grow. Hamilton's journey across the Atlantic was itself an act of transformation. Leaving the Caribbean meant severing ties with the place that had shaped him through struggle and responsibility. The voyage exposed him to the scale of the British Empire and the wider Atlantic world he had previously known only through trade ledgers and correspondence. This transition from colonial margins to the intellectual centers of North America expanded his sense of what was possible. The world was no longer something he merely observed. It was something he intended to shape. Upon arrival, Hamilton entered preparatory education in the mainland colonies, immersing himself in classical studies that formed the foundation of elite learning. Latin, Greek, history, and philosophy introduced him to ideas of republicanism, virtue, and governance that contrasted sharply with the brutal inequalities of Caribbean life. Unlike many of his peers, Hamilton approached learning with urgency rather than leisure. Education was not a social expectation for him. It was a lifeline, a means of securing permanence in a world that had never offered him stability. His intellectual promise soon led him to King's College in New York, an institution that would later become Columbia University. There, Hamilton distinguished himself through clarity of thought, argumentative precision, and a remarkable ability to synthesize complex ideas. He absorbed political theory and history while simultaneously engaging with the tensions of colonial society. Unlike students insulated by privilege, Hamilton viewed education as preparation for action. Knowledge, to him, was inseparable from responsibility. Living in New York also placed Hamilton at the center of growing political unrest. The city was a crossroads of commerce, ideas, and imperial authority, and debates over British rule increasingly shaped public life. Hamilton did not remain a passive observer. While still a student, he began writing pamphlets and essays that demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of constitutional issues and imperial politics. His voice, sharpened by early hardship and disciplined study, quickly gained attention beyond academic circles. The move to North America thus completed Hamilton's transformation from a gifted colonial clerk into a rising intellectual force. Education gave him structure, but it was his lived experience of disorder that gave his ideas urgency. The combination proved powerful. By the time revolutionary tensions erupted into open conflict, Hamilton was no longer an outsider seeking opportunity. He had positioned himself at the heart of political life, equipped with learning, ambition, and an unshakable belief that intellect and effort could overcome the limits of birth. When Alexander Hamilton entered King's College in New York, he arrived not as a privileged heir, but as a determined outsider driven by urgency and ambition. Unlike many of his classmates, whose futures were secured by family status, Hamilton viewed education as a rare and fragile opportunity. His background of loss and insecurity shaped his approach to study, giving his intellectual life a seriousness and intensity that set him apart from the start. For him, learning was not a refinement of character. It was the foundation of survival and advancement. At King's College, Hamilton immersed himself in a rigorous classical curriculum. He studied Latin and Greek, read ancient historians and philosophers, and engaged with Enlightenment thinkers whose ideas about government, liberty, and human nature were reshaping political thought across the Atlantic world. These texts provided him with conceptual tools to understand power and authority, but Hamilton did not treat them as abstract theory. He tested ideas against reality, constantly measuring philosophy against the instability and inequality he had experienced firsthand in the Caribbean. The intellectual climate of New York further sharpened his development. The city was alive with political debate as tensions between the colonies and Britain intensified. Classrooms, taverns, and printing presses became arenas of argument, and Hamilton quickly moved beyond academic study into public engagement. Still a student, he began publishing essays and pamphlets that displayed remarkable clarity, confidence, and command of political reasoning. His writing revealed not only deep study, but a strategic mind capable of persuasion and organization. Hamilton's academic life was also shaped by independence and discipline. Without family wealth to rely on, he supported himself through tutoring and careful management of limited resources. This necessity reinforced habits of efficiency and self-control that mirrored his intellectual style. He read widely, wrote constantly, and refined his arguments with precision. Professors and peers alike recognized that his talent extended beyond the classroom, hinting at a future defined by leadership rather than scholarship alone. King's College did not isolate Hamilton from the world. It placed him directly within its turbulence. As revolutionary sentiment grew stronger, the boundary between student and political actor blurred. Hamilton participated in debates about resistance, authority, and rights, gradually aligning himself with the patriot cause. Education did not pull him away from action. It prepared him for it. The campus became a training ground where theory, rhetoric, and real-world politics converged. Hamilton's studies at King's College were therefore less about completing a degree than about forging an identity. The institution provided structure, language, and intellectual confidence, but it was Hamilton's personal drive that gave these elements power. By the time open conflict erupted, he had already emerged as a formidable thinker and writer. King's College had not simply educated him. It had accelerated his transformation from a brilliant student into a revolutionary voice, ready to shape the future of a nation. The emergence of Alexander Hamilton as a political thinker began not on the battlefield, but at the writing desk. While still a young student in New York, Hamilton entered the volatile world of colonial politics through essays and pamphlets that revealed a mind already shaped by urgency and clarity. At a time when public debate was often dominated by older, established voices, his writing stood out for its confidence and precision. He did not merely echo popular grievances. He organized them into coherent arguments that framed resistance as both rational and necessary. Hamilton's early writings demonstrated a deep understanding of constitutional principles and imperial politics. He rejected the idea that parliamentary authority over the colonies was unlimited, arguing instead that legitimate power required consent and representation. Drawing on Enlightenment thought and classical examples, he challenged the logic of British supremacy while carefully avoiding reckless calls for chaos. His arguments reflected a belief that liberty was not the absence of authority, but the presence of just and accountable governance. Even in youth, Hamilton's revolutionary vision was structured rather than impulsive. What distinguished Hamilton from many contemporaries was his sense of order amid rebellion. While he supported resistance to British control, he feared uncontrolled popular violence as much as tyranny. His essays warned against mob rule and emotional excess, emphasizing discipline, unity, and institutional strength. Revolution, in his view, had to be guided by reason and leadership, or it risked destroying the very freedoms it sought to defend. This balance between radical change and stability would remain a defining feature of his political philosophy. The publication of his essays quickly elevated Hamilton's public profile. Readers were struck by the maturity of his prose and the sophistication of his reasoning, often unaware that the author was barely out of adolescence. His writing reached beyond academic circles, influencing merchants, artisans, and political organizers who sought intellectual justification for resistance. Through print, Hamilton entered the revolutionary movement as a voice of persuasion, shaping opinion rather than merely reflecting it. As tensions escalated toward open conflict, Hamilton's ideas evolved alongside events. He began to argue more explicitly that reconciliation with Britain was unlikely and that the colonies must prepare for decisive action. Yet, even as his tone hardened, his emphasis on structure and coordination remained constant. Independence, he believed, would succeed only if guided by strong leadership and a clear political framework. Freedom without order, in his eyes, was a fragile illusion. Hamilton's early political writings laid the foundation for his later influence as a revolutionary leader and statesman. They revealed a thinker already grappling with the central dilemma of the American Revolution: how to overthrow unjust authority without descending into disorder. Through careful argument and disciplined reasoning, Hamilton helped shape the intellectual landscape of revolution, demonstrating that ideas, when sharpened by experience and urgency, could become instruments of historical change. The American Revolutionary War transformed Alexander Hamilton from a political writer into a man of action, testing his ideas against the brutal realities of conflict. When war broke out, Hamilton did not hesitate to commit himself fully to the patriot cause. For him, the struggle was not only about independence from Britain, but about proving that disciplined leadership and organized power could give birth to a stable new nation. Military service offered him the opportunity to unite theory and practice, ambition and responsibility. Hamilton began his service as an artillery officer in the Continental Army, where his intelligence and technical skill quickly became evident. Artillery required precision, calculation, and calm under pressure, qualities that suited his temperament. He demonstrated courage in combat and an ability to command men effectively despite his youth. These early experiences on the battlefield taught him the importance of logistics, coordination, and discipline, reinforcing his belief that wars were won as much by organization as by bravery. His talents soon brought him to the attention of George Washington, who recognized Hamilton's exceptional abilities. Hamilton was appointed as Washington's aide-de-camp, a role that placed him at the very center of the Revolutionary War effort. Serving as Washington's principal secretary, Hamilton drafted correspondence, conveyed orders, and helped manage relations between the commander-in-chief, Congress, and the states. This position gave him an unparalleled view of the weaknesses of the revolutionary system, particularly the lack of centralized authority and reliable funding. Life at headquarters was intellectually demanding and emotionally intense. Hamilton worked relentlessly, often under immense pressure, witnessing firsthand the difficulties of sustaining an army without strong national institutions. Supply shortages, unpaid soldiers, and political interference convinced him that independence alone would not guarantee success. The war, as he experienced it, became a powerful lesson in the necessity of strong executive leadership and effective central government, ideas that would later shape his role in building the American state. Despite the prestige of his position, Hamilton longed for battlefield command, believing that true honor and recognition came through direct combat. Tensions eventually emerged between him and Washington, leading to a temporary break from staff service. This moment of frustration revealed Hamilton's intense ambition and desire for distinction. Yet, when opportunity finally came, he seized it decisively. That opportunity arrived at the decisive Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Leading an assault on a heavily fortified British redoubt, Hamilton displayed personal bravery and tactical skill. The successful attack helped break British defenses and contributed directly to the final American victory. For Hamilton, Yorktown was more than a military success. It was personal vindication, proving that he could lead men in combat as effectively as he could shape policy behind the scenes. Hamilton's service in the American Revolutionary War left an enduring imprint on his character and ideas. The conflict confirmed his belief that liberty required strength, unity, and capable leadership. War had shown him the dangers of fragmentation and the cost of weak institutions. By the time peace was secured, Hamilton emerged not just as a veteran, but as a thinker forged by experience, ready to apply the hard lessons of war to the task of building a nation strong enough to survive its independence. Serving as aide-de-camp to George Washington marked one of the most formative periods in the life of Alexander Hamilton, shaping his understanding of leadership, power, and the practical demands of nation-building. Appointed at a remarkably young age, Hamilton entered Washington's inner circle at a moment when the Revolutionary War demanded not only courage, but administrative discipline and political judgment. The position placed him at the nerve center of the Continental Army, where ideas met urgency and theory collided with scarcity. As Washington's principal aide, Hamilton became far more than a messenger. He served as secretary, strategist, and intermediary, drafting orders, official correspondence, and diplomatic communications that flowed between headquarters, Congress, and state governments. Through this work, Hamilton learned how fragile the revolutionary effort truly was. The Army lacked consistent funding, supplies were unreliable, and political authority was fragmented. Day after day, Hamilton translated Washington's strategic vision into written commands, gaining first-hand experience in the mechanics of command and the limits imposed by weak institutions. The relationship between Washington and Hamilton was built on mutual respect, though shaped by hierarchy and pressure. Washington recognized Hamilton's extraordinary intellect, work ethic, and clarity of thought, often relying on him to articulate policies with precision and force. Hamilton, in turn, admired Washington's steadiness and moral authority, seeing in him a model of executive leadership. Their collaboration formed a powerful partnership, one that blended Washington's restraint with Hamilton's urgency and analytical sharpness. Life at headquarters exposed Hamilton to the political dimension of war. He observed how Congress interfered with military decisions, how states resisted centralized authority, and how soldiers suffered as a result. These experiences deepened his conviction that liberty required strong national leadership. Independence, he concluded, would mean little without a government capable of sustaining an army, enforcing decisions, and commanding loyalty. The frustrations of his role reinforced ideas that would later define his vision for the United States. Despite the influence and responsibility of his position, Hamilton struggled with the limitations it imposed. As aide-de-camp, he was close to power but denied independent command. His ambition and desire for battlefield distinction eventually strained his relationship with Washington, culminating in a sharp dispute that led Hamilton to leave his staff position. This rupture revealed both his intensity and his hunger for recognition, traits that would continue to shape his career. Yet the years spent at Washington's side proved decisive. Hamilton emerged from this service with a rare education in leadership under crisis. He had seen how authority functioned in practice, how systems failed under pressure, and how individual character could sustain a cause when institutions faltered. The aide-de-camp years transformed Hamilton from a brilliant theorist into a seasoned statesman in training. When the war ended, he carried with him not only the lessons of victory, but a clear vision of the strong, energetic government he believed the new nation would need to survive. The marriage of Alexander Hamilton to Elizabeth Schuyler in 1780 marked a profound turning point in both his personal and social life. For Hamilton, whose childhood had been defined by instability, illegitimacy, and loss, marriage offered something he had never truly known: belonging within an established family. The union linked him to the influential Schuyler family of New York, one of the most prominent political and social networks of the Revolutionary era. Yet this was not merely a strategic alliance. Contemporary accounts suggest genuine affection, intellectual companionship, and emotional reliance between Hamilton and Eliza. Elizabeth Schuyler came from a world very different from Hamilton's Caribbean upbringing. Raised in comfort and privilege, she was the daughter of a powerful military and political leader, and had been educated in social refinement, faith, and civic responsibility. Through her, Hamilton gained access not only to elite society, but also to a model of family stability rooted in tradition and moral order. Eliza's calm disposition and strong religious values contrasted with Hamilton's restless ambition, creating a partnership that balanced intensity with restraint. Marriage did not remove Hamilton from public life. Instead, it deepened his sense of responsibility. As war continued and political pressures mounted, family life became both a refuge and a source of emotional vulnerability. Hamilton's letters reveal a man torn between devotion to his wife and children and an overwhelming sense of duty to the nation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not retreat into domestic quiet. The demands of public service often pulled him away from home, reinforcing the tension between private affection and public ambition. The Hamilton household gradually expanded with the birth of children, and fatherhood added a new dimension to Hamilton's character. He expressed pride, anxiety, and deep emotional attachment to his family, seeing in his children the promise of continuity and legitimacy he himself had lacked. At the same time, financial pressure remained a constant concern. Despite his prominence, Hamilton struggled to secure lasting economic stability, and family life was often shaped by uncertainty rather than comfort. These pressures heightened his drive for professional success and political influence. Eliza's role within the marriage extended far beyond domestic support. She managed the household during Hamilton's frequent absences, maintained social connections, and endured public scrutiny as her husband rose to national prominence. Her strength became especially evident during periods of crisis, when political attacks and personal scandals threatened to destroy Hamilton's reputation. Eliza's loyalty and endurance anchored the family through storms that might otherwise have shattered it. The marriage between Alexander Hamilton and Elizabeth Schuyler thus reflected the broader contradictions of Hamilton's life. It offered love, legitimacy, and connection. Yet it unfolded under the strain of relentless ambition and public controversy. Family life never replaced Hamilton's devotion to public service, but it shaped his emotional world and revealed his deep longing for order, permanence, and legacy. In Eliza, Hamilton found not only a wife, but a stabilizing force whose quiet resilience would outlast his own turbulent career and preserve his memory long after his death. The role played by Alexander Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was complex, controversial, and deeply revealing of his political philosophy. Arriving in Philadelphia at a moment of national uncertainty, Hamilton was convinced that the existing system under the Articles of Confederation was dangerously weak. The Revolutionary War had been won, but the peace that followed exposed financial chaos, interstate rivalry, and the inability of the central government to act decisively. For Hamilton, the convention was not merely an opportunity to amend a flawed system, but a rare chance to reconstruct the foundations of American governance. Hamilton's vision at the convention was the most nationalist and centralized among the delegates. He argued that liberty could not survive without strong authority, and that a weak government invited disorder, foreign manipulation, and eventual collapse. In a long and uncompromising speech, He proposed a model of government that drew inspiration from the stability of the British constitutional system, including a powerful executive and senators serving long terms. Although these ideas shocked many delegates and stood little chance of adoption, they forced the convention to confront fundamental questions about power, permanence, and the limits of Republican government. Despite the boldness of his ideas, Hamilton found himself politically isolated. New York's delegation was deeply divided, and when his fellow delegates withdrew in opposition to the convention's direction, Hamilton was left without formal voting power. Yet his influence did not disappear. Even when marginalized, he remained active in debate, using argument rather than numbers to shape discussion. His presence served as a counterweight, pulling the final document toward greater strength and coherence than many delegates had originally envisioned. Hamilton's most enduring contribution lay not in the specific proposals he offered, but in the pressure he applied to the convention's overall direction. His insistence on energy and government influenced debates over executive power, the structure of the Senate, and the independence of the judiciary. While compromises softened his most extreme positions, the Constitution that emerged reflected many of his core concerns. A single executive, the ability to raise revenue, a national judiciary, and supremacy of federal law over the states. Equally important was Hamilton's decision to sign the Constitution despite its imperfections. He recognized that the document was a product of compromise, not a reflection of any single vision. For Hamilton, the choice was pragmatic rather than ideological. A strong but imperfect constitution was preferable to continued fragmentation and decline. By lending his name and reputation to the final text, he helped legitimize it at a critical moment when public support was far from assured. Hamilton's role at the Constitutional Convention demonstrated both his strengths and his limitations. He was not a consensus builder in the traditional sense, but a catalyst who pushed boundaries and reframed debates. His willingness to argue unpopular positions expanded the range of possibilities under consideration and anchored the final document against excessive weakness. Though often outvoted and sometimes dismissed, Hamilton left Philadelphia having helped ensure that the new Constitution would create not just a republic, but a durable national state capable of surviving its own independence. In the aftermath of the Constitutional Convention, the future of the new framework of government remained uncertain, threatened by widespread skepticism and organized opposition. It was in this volatile moment that Alexander Hamilton emerged as the most tireless and strategic defender of the proposed Constitution. Ratification was far from guaranteed, especially in politically divided states such as New York. Hamilton understood that the Constitution would survive not through elite agreement alone, but through persuasion directed at the public itself. The battle for ratification would be fought with ideas, argument, and print. The result of this effort was the Federalist Papers, a series of essays written to explain, justify, and defend the Constitution in clear and forceful terms. Hamilton was the driving force behind the project, organizing its scope, setting its urgency, and writing the majority of the essays himself. Published under the shared pseudonym Publius, the essays sought to elevate public debate above fear and rumor, offering readers a systematic explanation of how the proposed government would function and why it was necessary. Hamilton's contributions focused especially on the dangers of weak central authority. Drawing directly from his experiences during the Revolutionary War, he argued that the Articles of Confederation had left the nation exposed to internal disorder and external threat. Without the power to raise revenue, regulate commerce, or enforce laws, the Union risked collapse. Hamilton framed the Constitution as a practical remedy to real failures, not as an abstract theory. Government, he insisted, had to be energetic to be effective, and effectiveness was the true safeguard of liberty. A central theme of Hamilton's essays was the defense of executive power. At a time when many feared tyranny, he argued that a single, accountable executive was safer than fragmented authority. Unity, duration, and responsibility, he maintained, were essential to decisive leadership. By carefully defining presidential powers and embedding them within constitutional limits, Hamilton sought to show that strength and restraint were not opposites, but partners. His arguments helped redefine the meaning of Republican government, shifting it away from pure suspicion of power toward controlled authority. Hamilton also addressed concerns about the judiciary, national taxation, and federal supremacy. He presented the courts as guardians of the Constitution rather than threats to liberty, emphasizing their role in protecting rights against legislative overreach. On taxation, he argued that shared national responsibilities required shared fiscal power. These essays revealed Hamilton's broader vision: a stable republic grounded in law, credit, and institutional continuity. He did not deny the risks of power. Instead, he argued that unmanaged weakness posed a far greater danger. The impact of the Federalist Papers extended far beyond the immediate ratification debates. While not all opponents were convinced, the essays played a decisive role in shaping public understanding and securing support in key states. More importantly, they became a lasting guide to constitutional interpretation, studied by lawmakers, judges, and scholars for generations. Through them, Hamilton ensured that the Constitution was not merely accepted, but intellectually defended. In defending United States Constitution, Hamilton did more than win a political argument. He articulated a vision of Republican government strong enough to endure crisis without sacrificing liberty. The Federalist Papers transformed the Constitution from a contested proposal into a coherent system of governance, and in doing so, they secured Hamilton's place as one of the most influential political thinkers in American history. The appointment of Alexander Hamilton as the first United States Secretary of the Treasury in 1789 placed him at the center of the most urgent challenge facing the new republic: survival. Independence had been won, but the nation was financially exhausted, burdened by war debts, unstable currency, and fragile credit. For Hamilton, this moment demanded bold structure rather than cautious improvisation. He understood that political independence without economic credibility would leave the United States weak, divided, and vulnerable to foreign influence. Hamilton approached the Treasury not as a bookkeeping office, but as the engine of national power. He believed that public credit was the foundation of sovereignty, and that a nation unable to manage its finances could not command respect at home or abroad. In a series of detailed reports to Congress, he proposed a comprehensive system to stabilize the economy. These plans were ambitious, controversial, and meticulously reasoned, reflecting his belief that effective government required coherent design rather than short-term compromise. Central to Hamilton's program was the assumption of state debts by the federal government. By consolidating Revolutionary War debts at the national level, he aimed to bind the states more closely to the federal system and establish the government's reliability as a borrower. Creditors, both domestic and foreign, would have a direct stake in the success of the new republic. Critics saw this as an expansion of federal power at the expense of states, but Hamilton viewed it as a necessary step toward unity and long-term stability. Equally transformative was his creation of a national financial infrastructure. Hamilton supported the establishment of a national bank to regulate currency, manage government funds, and provide stability to the financial system. He also introduced tariffs and excise taxes to generate steady revenue. These measures were not merely fiscal tools, they were instruments of state building. Hamilton believed that a strong economy required coordination between government and commerce, and that disciplined financial management could align private interest with public good. Hamilton's tenure at the Treasury placed him in direct conflict with political rivals who feared centralized authority. Debates over his policies crystallized the first major divisions in American political life. Yet even amid opposition, Hamilton remained consistent in his vision. He argued that economic strength would protect liberty by preventing chaos, foreign domination, and internal fragmentation. His belief in energetic government was rooted not in abstract theory, but in the hard lessons of war and instability. By the time Hamilton left office, the United States possessed functioning public credit, growing international confidence, and the foundations of a modern financial system. His legacy as Secretary of the Treasury extended far beyond policy details. He demonstrated that Republican government could be both strong and accountable, and that financial order was not the enemy of freedom, but its safeguard. In shaping the nation's economic architecture, Hamilton ensured that the American experiment rested on stability as well as ideals, transforming fragile independence into durable statehood. The financial system and economic reforms designed by Alexander Hamilton laid the structural foundations of the modern United States economy. When Hamilton assumed responsibility for national finance, the country was economically fragile, burdened by war debts, unreliable currency, and deep mistrust from foreign creditors. The revolution had secured political independence, but economic weakness threatened to undermine it. Hamilton understood that without financial order, the Republic would remain vulnerable to collapse, factionalism, and external pressure. At the core of Hamilton's vision was public credit. He believed that a nation's strength rested on its ability to honor obligations consistently and transparently. By restructuring existing debts and committing the federal government to full repayment, Hamilton aimed to establish credibility both at home and abroad. This policy transformed debt from a symbol of weakness into a tool of stability. Creditors became invested in the success of the federal government, aligning private financial interest with national survival. Hamilton's reforms also introduced a coherent monetary framework. The establishment of a national bank created a regulated financial center capable of issuing stable currency, managing government funds, and supporting commercial growth. Rather than viewing banking as a threat to liberty, Hamilton saw it as a mechanism for discipline and coordination. The bank linked agriculture, trade, and industry into a single system, allowing capital to circulate more efficiently across the nation. This integration marked a decisive break from the fragmented colonial economy. Revenue generation was another pillar of Hamilton's economic program. Tariffs and internal taxes were designed not only to fund the government, but to encourage domestic manufacturing and reduce dependence on foreign goods. Hamilton believed economic independence was inseparable from political independence. A diversified economy, supported by infrastructure and industry, would provide employment, innovation, and resilience against international disruption. These policies signaled a long-term commitment to national development rather than short-term survival. Hamilton's reforms also reshaped the relationship between government and the private sector. He rejected the idea that markets should function without structure, arguing instead that law, regulation, and credit systems were necessary for sustainable growth. By creating predictable rules and institutions, he encouraged investment and risk-taking within a stable framework. This approach helped transform the United States from a loose collection of agrarian states into an emerging commercial power. The economic reforms were controversial from the beginning. Critics feared centralized authority and accused Hamilton of favoring elites and financiers. Yet over time, the system proved durable. Public credit stabilized, commerce expanded, and the United States gained access to international capital markets. Hamilton's financial architecture endured long after his departure from office, shaping American economic policy for generations. In the end, Hamilton's financial system was not merely about money, it was a blueprint for national strength. By linking credit, governance, and economic growth, he ensured that the Republic would not depend on idealism alone. His reforms transformed economic chaos into structured power, proving that a democratic nation could build stability without sacrificing liberty, and that sound finance was not the enemy of freedom, but one of its strongest defenses. The rise of political rivalries in the early United States was inseparable from the ideas and ambitions of Alexander Hamilton, whose vision for a strong, centralized nation placed him on a collision course with other revolutionary leaders. In the fragile years following independence, political unity proved short-lived. Debates over power, finance, and the meaning of Republican government quickly hardened into personal and ideological conflicts. Hamilton did not merely participate in these struggles, he helped define them, becoming both an architect of the new system and one of its most polarizing figures. At the center of Hamilton's rivalry stood Thomas Jefferson, whose political philosophy clashed fundamentally with Hamilton's. Jefferson championed limited federal authority, agrarian independence, and deep suspicion of financial institutions. Hamilton, by contrast, believed that national survival required energetic government, public credit, and close ties between state power and economic development. Their disagreements were not abstract. They shaped policy battles over banking, taxation, and foreign alignment, turning cabinet meetings into arenas of ideological warfare. These conflicts intensified during their service under George Washington, who hoped to govern above faction. Despite Washington's efforts at balance, the opposing visions within his administration proved irreconcilable. Hamilton's financial system and Jefferson's resistance to it drew supporters into organized camps. What began as policy disagreement evolved into something more enduring: the formation of America's first political parties. Hamilton became the leading voice of the Federalists, while Jefferson emerged as the figurehead of the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton's rivalry with James Madison added another layer of complexity. Once close collaborators during the struggle for ratification of the Constitution, the two men drifted apart as Hamilton's economic agenda took shape. Madison increasingly aligned with Jefferson, fearing that Hamilton's system concentrated power too heavily in the federal government. Their break symbolized the fragility of revolutionary alliances and highlighted how rapidly shared goals could give way to competing interpretations of liberty. Political conflict in this era was not restrained by modern standards. Pamphlets, newspapers, and personal attacks became weapons in an escalating struggle for public opinion. Hamilton himself was both master and victim of this culture. His sharp pen and uncompromising style energized supporters but alienated opponents. Accusations of monarchism, corruption, and elitism followed him relentlessly, while he responded with equally forceful critiques of what he viewed as dangerous populism and foreign sympathies among his rivals. These rivalries had lasting consequences for the American political system. They normalized organized opposition and established the legitimacy of dissent within a constitutional framework. Yet they also revealed the costs of intense partisanship. Personal animosity blurred the line between principle and rivalry, shaping decisions that would echo for decades. Hamilton's role in these conflicts underscored both his brilliance and his rigidity. He helped create a system strong enough to endure division, even as he became one of its most embattled participants. In the end, the party conflicts of the 1790s were not a failure of the American experiment, but a test of it. Through rivalry and resistance, the Republic learned to absorb disagreement without collapsing. Hamilton's fierce engagement in these struggles ensured that debates over power, economy, and governance would remain central to American political life, confirming that conflict, when contained by institutions, could become a source of endurance rather than destruction. The public career of Alexander Hamilton was marked not only by intellectual brilliance and political achievement, but also by scandal that exposed the human vulnerabilities beneath his formidable reputation. In an era when personal virtue was closely tied to public legitimacy, private conduct could quickly become a political weapon. Hamilton's uncompromising style and prominence made him a frequent target, yet it was his own decisions that ultimately ignited the most damaging controversy of his life. The crisis emerged in the early 1790s when Hamilton became entangled in an extramarital affair with Maria Reynolds. What began as a private moral failing soon took on political dimensions when her husband attempted to exploit the relationship for financial gain. Payments made by Hamilton, intended to conceal the affair, later appeared suspicious to political opponents. In the charged atmosphere of early American politics, rumors of corruption carried explosive potential, especially for a man who had designed the nation's financial system. As accusations circulated, Hamilton faced a dilemma that revealed much about his character. Rather than allowing suspicions of financial corruption to linger, he chose to confront the issue directly. In an extraordinary and deeply personal act, he published a lengthy public confession, later known as the Reynolds Pamphlet, admitting to adultery in order to deny misuse of public funds. The decision shocked contemporaries. No major American statesman had ever exposed his private life so completely in defense of public honor. The immediate consequences were devastating. Although Hamilton cleared himself of official corruption, the moral cost was severe. His reputation suffered irreparable damage, his marriage endured intense public humiliation, and his enemies seized the opportunity to portray him as reckless and untrustworthy. The pamphlet fueled gossip, satire, and relentless press attacks, ensuring that the scandal would follow him long after the initial controversy faded. In choosing transparency, Hamilton sacrificed personal dignity for political principle. Public reaction to the scandal reflected deeper divisions within American society. Supporters admired Hamilton's willingness to protect the integrity of public office at any cost, seeing the confession as proof of his commitment to honesty in governance. Critics, however, viewed the episode as evidence of flawed judgment and moral arrogance. The affair became inseparable from broader political battles, reinforcing partisan narratives that framed Hamilton as elitist, impulsive, and dangerous to Republican virtue. The scandal also had lasting personal consequences. Hamilton's relationship with his wife was strained, but ultimately endured, marked by resilience and silence rather than public defense. Professionally, the controversy narrowed his political future. While his influence remained significant, his credibility as a unifying national leader was diminished. Rivals found it easier to marginalize him, and allies became more cautious in their support. In the broader arc of Hamilton's life, personal scandal did not erase achievement. but it reshaped legacy. It revealed a man driven by logic and honor to the point of self-destruction, willing to expose his deepest failings to protect the public sphere. The controversy underscored the risks of political life in a republic where character and power were inseparable. Hamilton's downfall in the court of public opinion became a warning as well as a testament that even the architects of nations remain vulnerable to their own humanity. The final chapter of Alexander Hamilton's life unfolded in a climate of bitter rivalry, wounded honor, and political exhaustion. By the early 19th century, Hamilton's influence remained substantial, but his enemies were many, and his patience was thin. Among those adversaries stood Aaron Burr, a talented yet enigmatic figure whose ambitions repeatedly clashed with Hamilton's vision for the Republic. Their conflict was not sudden. It was the result of years of mutual distrust, political obstruction, and personal resentment. Hamilton viewed Burr as a man of principle-less ambition, someone willing to bend ideology for advancement. Burr, in turn, believed Hamilton had used his influence to block his rise at critical moments, including elections and appointments. The tension escalated after Hamilton reportedly expressed a harsh judgment of Burr's character, remarks that circulated widely and wounded Burr's sense of honor. In an age when reputation carried tangible political weight, such slights were not easily dismissed. Burr demanded satisfaction, and the conventions of the time offered a grim solution. The duel took place in July 1804 at Weehawken, New Jersey, a secluded site already stained by earlier encounters of honor. On the morning of the duel, Hamilton arrived knowing the risks but unwilling to retreat. Accounts differ on his intentions, but evidence suggests he planned to fire wide or not at all, seeking to preserve honor without taking a life. Burr, however, fired directly. Hamilton was struck, mortally wounded, and carried back across the Hudson River, where he lingered in agony before dying the following day. Hamilton's death sent shockwaves through the young nation. Public reaction blended grief, outrage, and disbelief that one of the Republic's chief architects could fall in such a ritualized act of violence. The duel exposed the fragile boundary between personal honor and public responsibility, prompting renewed criticism of dueling itself. Burr, though legally cleared, was politically ruined. His career never recovered, while Hamilton's death transformed him from a controversial partisan into a tragic symbol. In death, Hamilton's legacy began to shift. The sharp edges of rivalry softened, and the scale of his contributions came into clearer focus. He had shaped the nation's financial system, defended the Constitution, strengthened executive authority, and argued relentlessly for national unity. His ideas continued to guide policy long after his voice was silenced. The institutions he built proved durable, outliving both his allies and his enemies. The personal cost of his death was immense, especially for his family. His wife endured profound loss, yet devoted her remaining years to preserving his papers, defending his reputation, and supporting charitable causes. Through her efforts, Hamilton's intellectual legacy was safeguarded, allowing future generations to engage with his ideas directly rather than through partisan distortion. The duel with Aaron Burr thus stands as both an ending and a lens. It revealed the intensity of early American politics, where personal honor and public life were dangerously intertwined. Hamilton's death closed a life driven by urgency, ambition, and belief in ordered liberty. Yet it also cemented his place in history. From the violence of that final morning emerged a lasting recognition that Alexander Hamilton, flawed and relentless, had helped give the United States not only independence, but the structures necessary to endure it.